Hola. Hi, everyone. For the people here and also for the ones that are seeing this presentation online. So welcome to the talk of Ron Wakkary. So Ron Wakkary is like professor of the School of Interactive Arts and Technology at Simon Fraser University and also professor in industrial design at Eindhoven University of Technology. For the last years, he has been leading the Everyday Design Studio at Simon Fraser University and also collaborating with me and some other people at TUE in the Wearable Sensors Lab. So I don't want to take more time from my side, and I just pass the word to Ron, who's going to be talking about his book, Things We Could Design in More Than Human-Centered Worlds. So Ron, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Oscar. Do you mind if I take my mask off just to talk? Okay. Oh, I can breathe again. Thank you for that introduction. So yes, I'm actually here visiting. I was in Eindhoven before, but I live in Vancouver in Canada, which is the unceded territory of the Coast Salish people, the Squamish, Musqueam, and Tsleil-Waututh nations. Yeah, so as Oscar said, I'm going to talk about this book, which just came out, and I want to start with a story, short story. So this is an encounter that I had one day coming home from work. This is actually my living room. And I walk in and I see this is one of my cats. His name is Rusty. We have 4 cats, actually. And a artifact we call a hook, which are counterfactual artifacts, actually, and the table, non-table. Now, by counterfactual artifacts is, in my design research, I design things that you wouldn't normally design. So, for example, the table, non-table is kind of like a table, but it moves every once in a while, randomly, on its own. And I do these things to kind of create spaces of inquiry, so I can kind of examine, try to understand, and have people actually live with these to kind of understand the kind of inquiry space that it opens up as a design researcher. And mostly I'm interested in the various relations that we have with the things that we make. But I also live with them, and we often do, just to kind of, as we're making them, to kind of understand some of the subtleties and nuances, and that's why it's in my home. And I don't know what it was. Maybe it was just something I ate that day, or I don't know what kind of mood I was, but I came home and I found this to be very strange. I had the presence of mind to take a photograph. And in some sense, it was feeling like I was a participant in one of my own studies. Like, what is this strange thing in my own home? But the real thing that felt strange was I really didn't know what was going on here. Now, maybe, of course, Rusty was doing what, a kind of feline friend, foe, or food kind of interaction. But I didn't see it that way. And I thought, this is what the German philosopher Peter Sloterdijk would call an interfacial loop, that when you're looking at somebody else, you're just enmeshed. You're in this world. And here was this world that I wasn't sure if I was a part of. Yet it included things that I'd made as a designer and a cat that, legally speaking, I own. So I have a certain kind of dominion as a human over what it is that's here, but yet I really wasn't sure if I was a part of this or I wasn't. And in some ways, that's kind of one of the various anecdotes or experiences, or what you might call the origin story for the book. What was it that I trained as a designer and someone who has fairly reasonable grasp on what is going on in the world? Why did I not understand what was happening? What else did I perhaps need to know or perhaps think about could be possible in understanding that situation? So this book is a post-human investigation. This was a look at maybe there's something beyond our understanding of what it is to be human, to understand these kinds of interactions of things that are not human. So I engage in what I call a critical and creative speculation of what might a post-human, rather than a human-centered design, look like or perhaps be. And my goal in the book was to theorize a practice of what I call designing with. And the good in this designing with was to better cohabit our more than human world. So that's what I set out as kind of aim for the book. Now, I'm not going to spend much time talking about this, but specifically, I actually described this as a nomadic practice, that I didn't want to see design to design as a single discipline. I wanted to look at it, I saw it as maybe it could be seen in a range of pluralities. There are all kinds of different ways in which we could design, and there are all kinds of different things that we could design. So I think sometimes when we talk about design as a discipline, it's actually exclusive rather than inclusive, and I wanted to be more inclusive about the way I understood design. So I called this nomadic practice rather than design discipline. So one of those nomadic practices I wanted to explore was this idea of post-human design. What would it mean to design things? So let me give you an example of another thing that really, I guess, puzzled me in some sense, or I think where we were lacking in terms of human-centered design. This is a patent by a Swedish industrial designer named Sten Gustaf Thulin. And I think it's really quite, even though it's a patent, it really quite elegantly shows you a solution to what we commonly understand as a design problem. And what it is actually shows that you take a long roll of plastic or polyethylene, and you fold it over once, and then you weld it, and then you cut it into rectilinear patterns, and then you cut out handles. You, in very few moves, very elegantly, with very inexpensive material, create what's actually the ubiquitous plastic bag. What used to be in almost every shopping area, we get these plastic bags. The problem that solved the convenience of how to take, particularly in America, North America, how to take your groceries to your car in 10 minutes. That was the problem, design problem. And it's really seen as this kind of design problem and a solution to a design problem. But what, of course, the problem does not include is what we know, the reality, the lived reality of the plastic bags. That is this, pick any ocean. This just happens to be the Pacific garbage patch, where there are millions, if not billions, of pounds of plastic floating around in these vortexes of currents in any one of our oceans. And so I really wanted to try to understand how could we think of this as the way, what we are designing. And I will come back. How can we be inclusive of all of this, not just what we bring into the world, but how it actually exists in the world and what we leave behind. So there's, I guess, there are three concepts in the book. Speaking, subject, biography, and constituency, which I think help us understand the sort of theorizing this practice. I'm telling you now because there's going to be a bit of a journey to get to me explaining those, but I'm just going to tell you up front. I guess if there was a quiz on this on this talk, this is what you would actually be quizzed on. But there's a little bit of story I need to, or more I need to tell before I get there. So, thinking past my own personal understandings of what I think are the issues, what are the larger issues I think we face, and what is it that I think is an issue that we need to address in human-centered design. That when we think about human-centered design, it's really grounded in what we would understand philosophically, legally, economically as humanism. And a Western European way of thinking developed over the centuries that is so infused. We are in an era of humanism. And the sense of humanism is about what does it mean to progress as humans, as a humanity. How do we see and extend and perfect the notion of human reason? And if we do that, human reason has a way, the notion being that if we could perfect who we are in our humanity, we will control, manage, or take care of our world in a way that appeals to our human reason and our human values. But and I think now more than ever, I think we understand the real limitations or the inheritance of this of humanism. That we live in a world in which, first of all, not everybody was actually seen to have the capacity to be a perfect human. That through the histories of which we know, the legacy in which those that were not seen to fit the humanist model were seen as less than human or uncivilized, brown, black, whatever, that this is actually a part of some of the systemic racism that we've now inherited. But also humanism set humans apart from nature, in opposition to nature, in opposition to technology. But in this opposition to nature, we were able to exploit it for our own needs. We're responsible for any number, at the moment, probably the largest set of extinctions of other species, flora and fauna that we have seen. And so, in some sense, this legacy needs to be rethought, and human-centeredness is directly connected to this. It could be seen as a human exceptionalism, that our values are actually more important. If any kind of trade-off would come down to nature versus human, and even this nature versus human is a humanist construct, it would be about human values. And this is Leonardo da Vinci's Vitruvius Man, which was the application of the architect Vitruvius, the perfect proportions that you would have in architecture, and applied to the human body to come to symbolize what it meant for this perfection. But while we were also so focused on what it was to be human and how to perfect that notion and how we would be in this world, we at the same time overlooked the real effects that we had and the scale of those effects. That is, simultaneously, we now live in the age of the Anthropocene. That human impact and human effect has been global and planetary, that we have put ourselves, inscribed ourselves into the geological record. We've transformed the planet on a scale that no other species has done. And that was actually the real effect, but something that we were not even aware of. This is what Bruno Latour, a philosopher, says. One of the worst things about the age of the Anthropocene is that it's over before we even realized it was a thing. So it's kind of this thinking of casting around. I mean, that's all pretty bad, but really, how do we cast around and think about what might be an alternative? How might we think through this? And that's what led me to thinking about posthumanism. And the posthumanism is a critical set of ideas and philosophies and theories that think through some of these issues that I raised about the ideas of humanism. And there are many notions in relation to posthumanism. I try to explain them in the book in relation to design. But there are two in particular that I think are most compelling and interesting and hopefully will help you understand the talk today. The first is relationality. So one of the things, this notion that everything is in relation to something else, including humans, nature, and technology. So these things are not separated. One of the notions of humanism is that we are all, humans are autonomous. They're not dependent on others that are not human around them. But that's really not the case in posthumanism. We are in relation to other things and to the world around us. And so we don't separate these oppositions with nature. We don't set up these oppositions with technology. Another concept of posthumanism is this idea of shared agencies. That, in a sense, we again tend to think in the humanist notion that humans are the only ones that have any real agency in the world, have a level of consciousness that allow us to have more effect on the world than anything else. Posthumanism flattens that notion and distributes and shares the notion of agency. It's not that one needs to have reasoning or consciousness, but agency in the sense of having effect. Others, things beyond human, there are more than human effects on the world. And we are always working in relation to those, whether it's in concert or against. So let me give you an example of that. This, I don't know if anyone recognizes this event. This was actually, of course, this is the peak of Mount Everest. This is a particular day, May 29th, 2019, not too long ago, which was quite a tragedy. This was the traffic jam leading up to the peak of Mount Everest. And there's a short window in which you can climb the summit, but more importantly, that you can descend from the summit. Most deaths, most tragedies happen on the descent down from the top of the mountain. And because of all this delay, this traffic jam, this overpopulation of the top of Mount Everest, 11 people died on this day. Now that's enough to show this image, just the tragedy. But what I wanted to show is the fact that this relationality, we might begin to think that this notion that our understanding of nature, the remoteness of it, the non-humanness of it, is in direct relation to us. In other words, this is Mount Everest, the most remote place above sea level. Yet our understanding of it is the most remote place above sea level. Our understanding of its very remoteness is because we perceive it and we understand it. We relate to it. It gets that, it's that relationality. Mount Everest as a remote nature could not be remote nature without us. At the same time, it shapes us. So in a sense now, look at a mountain and say, it's a landscape to be climbed. A mountain becomes a set of paths that you want to ascend up to its summit. So there's a relationality of what is nature, what is the mountain, what is Mount Everest, and who are these people as mountain climbers? Those who are on expeditions and so on. But another relationship is technology. Each of these are actually encased in technologies, if you like. To become a climber is to have the kind of technologies that will keep you warm when it's minus 50 degrees or minus 40 degrees out there. That is the Gore-Tex and the fleece, and this is to increase your, maintain your body temperature. But also climbers wear oxygen supplement systems so they can actually have extra oxygen. And visors so you can see despite the sun and the proximity and the glare off of the snow. That a mountain climber is one that is in relation to the technology, and the technology that's here is in relation to the mountain climber. So this is a kind of complete, this really kind of demonstrates that in fact one can't be defined without the other. It also shows a degree of shared agency. We could not climb the summit without the agentic capacity of the various technologies and the equipment that the mountain climbers have. It simply could not be done. But not only that, the oxygen itself is a certain kind of vitality that you get through the systems that they wear, the supplemental systems. But the very condition of the climb is one that is part of the shared distributed agency of the temperature, the wind, the oxygen levels, etc. All of this combined to make the mountain climbing experience. So we can see how relationality and distributed agency is something that is something we live with every day. But this brings me to one of the first discussions in the book, which is the idea that humans and things are interconnected. We can't think of them separately from each other. And as I said that, well, this interconnectedness or relationality is an everyday event, and that means that obviously every day we're not climbing Mount Everest. But it happens in the sense that you're wearing clothing. This is, that it transforms who you are. This is a example. This is a running garment, illuminated running garment designed by fashion tech designer Pauline van Dongen, and it's called Phototrope. And it's a running garment that illuminates itself. And by doing so, it allows the runner to become a night runner or a nocturnal runner. It makes themselves present in the dark landscape and also illuminates the dark landscape. So there's an interconnectedness. There could not be a nocturnal runner without this. This is no different than someone riding their bike and having a light on top of their bike, or someone in a car with the headlights on at night. This is what the feminist philosopher Donna Haraway would call a cyborg. That is this cyborgian relationship between us, this interconnectedness between us and technology. And she argues we are already cyborgs. This is not something that is about to happen. This is something that is happening. Another phrase that I like is by Carrie Wolf, who says that humans are prosthetic creatures. And often we think about, oh, will someone use the very thing that we make? As humans, through this interconnectedness, we will always find a use in some sense, or we will make it a part of us, which goes beyond use. And so this idea that we are prosthetic creatures, that we're looking for things to connect to us and become a part of us. And this goes beyond running or functionality. This could even be true of spirituality and religion. If you think of the prosthetic nature, this is actually, well, first of all, this is a piece by Bill Gaver. It's called The Prayer Companion. And what it is bringing news media from the internet to the nuns who are, they're cloistered nuns, so they live within a cloister. They live within the nunnery. So they can get news about the outside world so they can pray. But it goes beyond that particular technology, the technology of clothing, the habit that they wear, the architecture, all of the other artifacts around it are part of this interconnectedness that through that there's an understanding of spirituality or religion. And it's not a big surprise because we're not the only prosthetic creature in the world. This is a study by Sarah Gelbert that she did with crows, in which she designed a number of vending machines. You can see the crow is actually putting a token inside that vending machine, and then they would get food or other bits. But what she did was she would change the shape of the token that's required and the color of the token that was required, and give the crows the material, and they would cut them out with their beaks and shape it to use in the vending machine. In that sense, that again, that we are not the only prosthetic creatures in the world. But returning to the notion of being human, I think that this interconnectedness shows that to design things is to fundamentally shape what it is to be human. And in some sense, when you first hear that, you might think, well, that gives you a lot of power as a designer, but I'll get to that in a minute. So the next thing I want to discuss, or as an aspect of the book, is that it's humans and things together that are transformative. So again, this is a posthumanist notion, not the humanist notion that that we are the agentic force in the world, and through the materials that we use that extend our abilities, that it's actually together, each have their own ways of affecting and shaping the world. Does anyone know what this is? Anyone want to guess? Yes?
Yeah, it's a light for the people who use it in their phone.
That's exactly what it is. So this is a prototype traffic light for those on their mobile phone. So if you're on the phone and you're coming up to the intersection, you go, oh, okay, red, I better stop, or good things won't happen. You don't have to look up. Now, of course, when this was actually installed, many people were upset. They thought, well, again, this just feeds our addiction to technology, as if technology was something separate from us that we could become prey to. Or that this, again, being on your phone separated you from the real world and who you were. You were lost in this virtual world. But in fact, when you think about this technology, humans, nature combined, this is the technological world. It's technicity. We are all a part of this. No more real or no less real. But it's not just with the mobile phone. If you think about a traffic intersection, how different is being on your mobile phone and looking for a traffic light than being encased in a car, driving along, needing a traffic signal to tell you when to stop and when to go, or being on your bicycle and being able to see a traffic light for you that you can stop and go, or even as a pedestrian that is clothed in a way that they could be in the outside world, is also cyborg, is related to technology, so they can come and go across the traffic intersection. That this notion that it's any different with another technology, this is just something we have been doing over and over again, but that comes back to the fact that we are interconnectedness, but this interconnectedness is what transforms the world around us. But another aspect of this is that really when you look at a traffic intersection, it's the different parts of the traffic intersection that in some sense are doing the designing. They're shaping each other. It makes total sense to have that kind of traffic light for someone with a mobile phone. It's almost as if the things designed or transformed other things to fit the world of what the philosopher Bruno Latour would call networks. The world is really networks of humans and non-humans. And it's these networks that actually shape things, not an individual human or just humans alone. Or what Deleuze and Guattari would call assemblages, that also includes the forces that are at work as part of the assemblage. So we begin to think now in terms of distributed agency sense. There's not just human agency, and we could see this happening across networks and assemblages. And we have to put design, position design, with respect to that understanding. This is a portrait of Roger van der Weyden, who happened to, this is of course one of those, Northern Renaissance portraits. I don't know if you know about you, but you always look at it and you go, well, why are they so dark? Why are they so, who are these people? They're obviously people of power and people of wealth. Yet they seem so austere and they seem so dark. And as it turns out, it's the black that they're wearing, which is the very symbol of their power and their wealth. It is what is known as Burgundian black. So this was the era of Burgundy. And the Burgundian black was a very particular kind of black. It wasn't just any black. In fact, they would have auditors or judges who had the expertise, who could subjectively look at a piece of clothing, usually it's dyed wool, and say, yes, this is real Burgundian black versus the fake stuff that would be used by mixing in coal or you know, other the knockoffs of Burgundian black. So this was something that was really sought after, and the way in which the recipe for that dye was jealously hidden and kept secret by the guilds. This is Claudia Youngster, who's a textile artist in the Netherlands. And she was part of a research project, and they were looking at how to reconstruct the recipes for Burgundian black, because much of it was lost in Old Flemish, or the recipes were not really clearly detailed, and the ingredients were not always clear. As a textile artist, she really understands the materials and where they come from. For example, the wool she uses comes from her own herd of sheep that she actually has. And the dyes are all vegetable dyes that were grown in her own garden that is just outside the studio. So she was the perfect one to do this experimentation to determine what does it take to make Burgundian black. And as it turns out for her, Burgundian black is kind of a blue and red that comes together that really makes a certain kind of combination. So the blue comes from indigo, or in Europe that would be the woad plant. And the woad plant needs to be fermented for 3 to 4 months and needs to be properly watered depending on what the weather is to get the fermentation right, to get the color right. But also what's added is this, which is the root of a madder plant. The root of a madder plant, to get the right color, has to be at minimum somewhere between 3 to 5 years old, ideally 10 years old, and then needs to be dried for 2 years. These are these living matter processes that contribute to what we would call, to what becomes Burgundian black. These are not passive materials. They're something that need to actually live and have a certain kind of life in order to contribute to the process and the design to make Burgundian black. This is what Diana Cool and later Jane Bennett wrote the book on vibrant matter, which I highly recommend, would call agentic capacities. That material and things have a capacity to affect the world, and this is what she was talking about. There's an aliveness to things that are not human. So when I talked about before, we might think that the design is to fundamentally shape humans, or let us say our world, and you might think as a human designer that makes you quite powerful. However, human agency is shared, it's partial, and it's limited. That we are designing with all of these other capacities and abilities. So the last of the points of discussion, before I get to my speaking subjects, the things you're going to be quizzed on, is things are relational. So again, when you come to humanism, often what we think is that things are defined, things are fixed, things are independent. But remember, when we talk about relationality, things are interdependent, which also means that their meaning is relational. So their meaning can change depending on what they're in relation with. So this is one of the counterfactual artifacts that I make. It is a tilting bowl. So it is, as it sounds, it is a ceramic bowl that on occasion tilts. And this tilting of it makes it counterfactual. Why would anybody design that? But it is that counterfactual part that opens up, maybe we can inquire about how artifacts relate to us in ways that are different, how things relate differently. And so in this particular case, we wanted to do a study where we had philosophers live with them because we were trying to understand the relations to things. And we've done a number of studies. They lived with it for 3 months. They lived with it for up to 2 years. And then we try to describe and discuss what was the experience like. So this is a photo from one of the studies in which 2 philosophers lived with the tilting bowl. And you can see inside the tilting bowl, there's a metal tin cup. And there's a piece of paper that leans up against it. This is what they called their tilting trap, because they wanted to know, would it tilt when we're not there? And if it does, how would we know? So the idea that when the bowl tilts, they would hear it if they weren't in the room, or they would know because the piece of paper fell over. And so they thought, well, this was a good way, then we can really reflect on what that experience was, even if we weren't there. Now, the way we do it is we interview people. As I said, they live with it for a period of time, so we might come back several weeks later or a month later and interview them again. So when we returned several weeks and we interviewed them, this came up about their tilting trap. They said, politically, think about that politically. That's the way refugees are treated sometimes. The same kind of surveillance with the bull, the same suspicion exactly. So the relationality is such that you can go from something that tilts and is kind of as silly as a bull that tilts, to making a series of connections and relations that lead you somewhere where it's actually quite urgent and political in this sense. That this connection between our relationship to things and our relationship to things that we consider, going back to my comment about less than human, our whole really, thus in us in global north, or this really strife-ridden relationship we have with those in the global south, are issues of migration. And they put into this the idea of surveillance. And so in a sense, this relational meaning can go in many ways, but ultimately I think it leads into the political. And what I mean by the political is not necessarily it's about voting or governments, but it's about how we negotiate what this means and what's the value or ethics behind that meaning. This is a public bench. And like any bench, you can obviously sit on it. You can lie on it. You can hide underneath it. You can stand on top of it and use it as a stage and shout. There are many things that you can do with a bench, this kind of relationality. This is what post-phenomenologists and other kind of philosophy would say the multi-stability of things. Things have many different kinds of stabilities. They have many different kind of relations depending on the situation, the embodied situation. Here's another bench. This is actually my hometown in Canada, in Montreal. This is the metro station, the Laurier station. And you see this, and it's really quite playful. You know, this idea, oh, look at this. It's a public amenity. It's really well designed. It's really quite playful. This is what the philosopher Robert Rosenberger calls a callous object. What he means is that something that is designed, when we design things, they have different meanings, they have different relationalities. But when we design it in a way where we try to shut down those relationalities and create a particular kind of space, that he looked at public benches, as you can see, as you see many public benches, they have this so-called function or feature of an armrest. Now, if you're not unhoused, you're not homeless, you don't think anything of it. But if you are unhoused or homeless, you realize what this is truly about, because no one really needs an armrest at the bench. This is a design that stabilizes a particular kind of stability to create a public space that is exclusionary, not inclusionary. Through this design and feature, it actually polices or disciplines what public space is and who is considered public and who is not. And so in a sense, this is what we talk about with this kind of, the things are not so innocent. Things have these kinds of relations, different meanings that need to be negotiated. This is probably one of the, I think, one of the worst offenders in terms of this idea of policing public space. This is the Camden Bench, which is in London. It's right across from the Freemasons Temple, if you've ever been to London. It is billed as the anti-graffiti, because it's coated with a particular resin, so you can't graffiti it. It is anti-skateboarding because of the shape of it. It's very hard to skateboard off of. It is anti-theft, so you can't, if someone puts their bag or purse down, you can't reach behind and steal it. It is anti-homeless. It is anti-terrorist because it is, you can't move it. You can't, it is there as a blocking, you know, to block anything. So it is really determining through this public amenity, politicizing and creating a particular kind of public space. But like all things political, they can always be contested. Negotiation is about, there's no one way that something is meant to be. You actually have to negotiate, and sometimes that negotiation takes on the form of resistance. And here is a resistance against a designed thing. It's about whose public space is it, and sure enough, there is a Camden Bench skateboard trick, as you would expect. So the design of this is what Robert Rosenberg calls politicals of occlusion, that when we deny the fact that things could be politically understood, we are actually really trying to hide the politics and meanings of things. This, closer to home for me, this is Fairy Creek, which is on Vancouver Island, which is near Vancouver. This is these are activists, protesters, blockading the road to an old-growth forest and to old-growth trees. And old-growth trees are an obvious political matter. This is what Bruno Latour calls matters of concern, that we can't have, once we actually create, or even if we don't create it like an old-growth tree, politics and matters of concern gather around this thing that we designed. And of course, we can see this played out in the two different ways in which each of these are interconnected with the various technologies of clothing, design, objects of disciplining that the police have. And of course, it's a clear power imbalance. But this is all playing out as matters of design, as well as other matters. Okay, so there was a lot that I talked about, drinking through these various ideas, and now the question might be, oh, that's all really okay, but how do we respond to this? How do we consider this in the context of design? Well, I think what we tend to do is we tend to think about design in the abstract. We write the word design, and really what we're not putting in there, that it's humans that design for humans, because we don't need to, because we're in an era of kind of human, as I said, exceptionalism. We have this notion that to design is universal, or it's abstract, and you're always trying to understand what is that universality of design, and I would argue there isn't a universality about design. Design is quite relational, it's distributed, it's multiplicity, it's pluralism. So I like to think of design as design with. It's an easy thing. Whenever you think about I'm going to design, think about what am I going to design with. And in many cases, even though if you're not aware of what you're going to design with, you do in fact design with other things that catch up to you, right? And so what I've been describing to you is what I call design with, which is accepting the notion that humans and things are interconnected, humans and things are transformative, and things are relational. And they each have particular implications. And the question is, how do we conceive of these and deal with these implications with respect to design? So let's take humans and things are interconnected. If humans and things are interconnected in the way I talked about, then when we talk about the designer, we can't think of the designer as exclusively human. We can't have this understanding and then relate back to what we understood as human-centered design. So designers are humans and non-humans, what I call an assembly of humans and non-humans. So this means that in effect, we need to design with things that are not human and understand the agentic effects that those have, the way they transform the world as much as we do, and this co-shaping that happens. In a sense, we need to understand what it means to design when we are not in control and we don't fully know everything. So the metaphor I use for this is like flying a kite. We might say, hey, I want to fly a kite. I say, I want to fly a kite. And if I grab a kite and I go to the beach, and I let it go and I start running. After that, it really depends on the shape of the kite, the material of the kite, the wind, the temperature, the air pressure. All of this is flying the kite with me. And I don't have control over its exact flight path. I have to work in concert, pay attention to, understand, and listen to what is happening. And I gather up, and one way I like to think about it is that we gather up all of these other forces, these non-human forces together to fly a kite. So if we're in this assembly of humans and non-humans that are the designer, our particular role as humans in this assembly is what I call the speaking subject. The speaking subject is the one, like you, that has language, whereas things and non-humans don't. Or they have their own language, but we do have a kind of primacy over human language. But our job as a speaking subject is not just to speak for the things, but to understand the things, to gather the things, to gather non-humans, what it takes to fly a kite. We might be at the origin of the design, like I might say, I'm the one who wants to fly, I want to fly a kite. I'm at the origin, but that doesn't mean that I then have control over what the flight path is or whether that even flies. And that's really what happens in design. We happen to call this unintended consequences. But in fact, everything has unintended consequences. Everything, we can't account for all what's going to happen because of all what I just explained. So we need to design within that reality. And we need to understand what our role is within that. We take the next part, that humans and things are transformative. This really brings up the notion that it's not just us that creates the world, but we create it with others. So going back to what I started with, this plastic bag and the Sten Gustav Tulin plastic bag, and we just simplify and say, was designing with plastic. Plastic has its own agentic capacities. That agentic capacity to be cheap, the agentic capacity to scale up, the agentic capacity to be easily manipulated to be produced, the agentic capacity to pollute, the agentic capacity to have toxicity, to release that into the world that we are cohabiting, because the fact of the matter is, whoever designed that is cohabiting that same world that you make. Whatever we design is the same world that we are in. We're not designing for others in that sense. We're always designing for ourselves. The term I like to use to think about this is what I call biography. So biography is really made up of two parts. Bio, which means life, and graphy, which means to write. So we can all understand our own, we have a biography. And as designer, we can even understand that the things we design are part of that biography, whether we like it or not. Once we design, that's part of us. We designed it. And that's in the simplest common sense term. But the way I like to look at it is that the thing that we design shares a bios. It shares a life with us. All right? Sten Gustav Tulin, whether he likes it or not, has shared a life with the plastic bag that he designed. And it's a shared life, which is a kind of bios, and we need to understand that. We can never leave the thing that we design. We bring it into this world. It's going to have a life with us. So then we have to try to account for the graphy, the writing part of the biography, which means we understand how this shared life inscribes itself or writes itself into our world. What happens? What are the effects? Something we have to pay attention to. But the other thing about a biography, they always end. Biographies don't go on forever. We don't live forever. One of the things that we do as designers is we rarely ever think about the end of the thing we're designing. And in fact, there may be multiple ends. I don't know when the plastic bag in that garbage patch actually disappears as a plastic bag to have some die again as something else, a die again to eventually become microplastics. But if we think about biographies, we think about our shared life, the shared life that is created. We think about the effects that are put into the world, and we think about the end, which I think is something that we can start to conceive of. And sometimes we want to design things that don't last forever. And I would say more than not, we actually want to design things that we know exactly how they're going to end and what that end is going to be like. So I would call this, and I do in the book, I call it an anti-biography. It's anti-life. And I think we're actually more than not, unfortunately, the things we design are anti-biographies. I have many examples in the book, but here's another one. You think about our apps, our free apps, which really we all know now, they're free because they want to collect data about us. Collect data, our location data, 7 seconds, every 7 seconds or every 21 seconds, they know exactly where you are, depending on how many apps you have, which constructed and created this data surveillance capitalism world that we cohabit. That's what that does. And this is, again, an anti-biography. If we think through what might be the ends of these things. But we don't. We want to think about the immediate gain of this, the transactional thing about I get an app for free, we get some data, we can make some money, et cetera, et cetera. But not wanting to just have it's all crappy, because it mostly is crappy, but when we get to something that's a little more positive, this is actually, this is designed by the architectural firm Aleph Zero and Marcella Rosenbaum. It's called Children Village, and it actually is a dormitory for a school in northern Brazil. And the dormitory is made up of eucalyptus woods. Eucalyptus trees were brought into Brazil around the 19th century, which are sort of local to that area. The stones are actually they're made from the earth itself that was excavated. They're mud, stone bricks that were made, and then there is the corrugated cardboard over top. So in some sense, you could already look at it and you can see its way in which it is clearly designed with its environment and its surrounding, and used to really, it's open because it's used to channel air and to keep people cool and, to manage the climate. But in the sense of biography, it's designed to end and in a way that will just, in a sense, return back to where it started. It has that end already in mind. Okay. So I've talked about speaking subject and I've talked about biography. So the last term I want to talk about is constituency. And a lot of what I've been really talking about is the fact that these things are political, that there are these negotiated meanings. In a more than human world, we have to understand, bring into design all of this that we need to negotiate with, not just other humans involved, but those that are not human. And when I mentioned the design problem was far too narrow. And what it does is actually excludes almost everything I talked about. I mean, I think that was clear in the patent and the plastic bag. So how do we bring these matters of politics into design? I call it constituency. I think there needs to be a shift. First of all, we need to understand that we don't design alone, but we design collectively. And that's just collectively in the more than human sense, but collectively with each other. And I think one of the things that we need to focus on is the idea of what are the collective structures by which we design. And I call this a constituency because it's what and who do we gather, including those that are not human, before we think about what kind of designer do we need and what is the thing that we're going to design. So the metaphor that I can think of is the kitchen. And first of all, what's like about the kitchen is there's no one way to have a kitchen. So this goes back to multiplicity. It goes back to the idea of nomadic practices. Kitchens have their own, they arise regionally, ethnically, religiously. They arise for any number of reasons, the landscape that they're in, the climate. So there are different kinds of kitchens. But if you look at a kitchen is a gathering. It's a gathering of the ingredients that you want to use to cook. It's a gathering of the technologies that you're going to use to cook with. It's a gathering of the air. It's a gathering of the architecture. But it's also a negotiation of the things, what kind of kitchen is this? What does it value? What is the heritage? What is the place? What is the culture? But also, what are the politics? Is this a vegan kitchen? Is this a vegetarian kitchen? Is this a non-GMO kitchen? All of these things are negotiated. They're gathered, and everyone has to do that within their kitchen before anything's cooked, before you know who the cook is, before you know what's going to be cooked. All of this is brought in some sense, negotiation. I see there's a wonderful metaphor for thinking about design, that we gather what it is that's going to be the assembly, the constituency, the gathering. This is the role of the speaking subject. And then we think about, from there we might think about who or what is the designer and what is the something that we want to design. Now, this is what Jane Bennett calls a political ecology of humans and non-humans. This is my own studio, and the studio was a wonderful starting point for this. Part of my problem is that my studio, actually, when I wrote the book, I was well ahead of where I am now, and I need to bring my studio toward being a constituency, to be much more attentive to the non-human or more than human gatherings of the studio. I think we have a kind of political direction that needs to be much more explicit. In the book, I talk about the Life Patch Collective, which is based in Yogyakarta, Indonesia. Why I chose this was in the sense that, first of all, it was really interpreted as a do-it-yourself kind of collective. But in Indonesian context and in a global South context, the really important notion was do it with others, not do it yourself. And do it with others meant that they did projects like, for example, they were working with understanding the toxicity of the Yogyakarta River, the bacteria and how drinkable it would be. So the non-human elements of the bacteria in the water were part of the collective. They did a lot of projects on fermentation. They were part of the collective. But also, it extended to, they saw the role of the designer extended to their maternal lineage, their parents, their mothers and their grandmothers, and how they influenced what it is and who they were as designers were all part of the constituency and informed what it meant to design. What would be a designer? What would be the something you'd want to design? Just at Dutch Design Week, one of my favorite pieces was at the project by the studio McKink and By, and they have a project called Water School. And Water School is a neighborhood, series of city blocks in Rotterdam, where they are creating a design education center, but is also an open studio, and is focused on the notion of water. And so who are all the relations, human and non-human, related to water? Who are the stakeholders? And how do we design with the notion of water and preserving it as part of our community? So as an example, one of the materials that they design with is wastewater from that neighborhood. How do we work with and understand the role of wastewater as a stakeholder or a member of our constituency? Okay, so now I'm going to end. So this comes back to Rusty and the table, non-table, and trying to think, okay, well, how do I make sense of this? And I think that certainly with notions of relationality, that there is no one way to make sense of this. With a sense of distributed agency and not knowing is I need to be generous and allow for whatever it is that's going on there to be what's going on. But my role as designer is to go alongside, to think with, to act with, to be with. Table, non-table, the cat. It means some transformation on my part. I need to give up my role as the person standing above this, taking the photograph, to perhaps the person that gets down alongside what's going on here, to become a part of this. And I think that that is a shift in our role as designers. We need to find ways to get down, change our methods, change our practices, change our relations, that we be horizontal and be alongside things that are more than human. Thank you.
So Ron, thank you for your presentation.
Oh, it was a long time.
Yeah, and I hope that for the ones that are here and for the ones that are online, this was like useful. I think that especially for the students from the master program, I think that now you understand, for example, why we ask you to define what you like and who you want to be. So we are asking you to start, or at least make your biography explicit. We also are asking you to map what's your working space and what the things you have around, to also make your constituency explicit. So it's not just you, it's all the things you have around. And we start working in relation to these design spaces as spaces of possibilities, to understand also the agency that the other things have on you and your work. But I think it's not my time to talk, but I think it's the time for you to ask. So maybe you have some questions or comments that you want to say to Ron? Do we have any questions? So I'll just go one by one, yeah? So for order of hand raising, if that's...
Yeah, well, I didn't understand the thing of the children's village. Like you said that it's designed to end, like why?
It's not designed to end, sorry. It's designed with the end in mind. It understands what it's going to be at the end of its existence as architecture. And that understanding is that when it decays, it does in a way that is actually already part of the habitat or world that it's in. So it cohabits even as it decays. And I contrast that to the plastic bags, for example.
Sorry, I'm just making a photo. So you also wanted to ask something?
Yeah. Thanks. It was super interesting, the kind of topics that you spoke about. But I was, when you were talking about political things, under that, you kind of, I would just want to paraphrase you. You said something like matters of politics into design.
Yes.
So just kind of trying to do a little wordplay with it. I would just want to know your opinion on it. What if we try to think of matters of design into politics rather than matters of politics into design? And I would just want to add, when I say politics, maybe that's not the right word, but what I kind of mean is you know how physicians have a Hippocratic oath where you're kind of accountable to things?
Yeah.
So now when you're talking about design and you're trying to think of design, what I understood by the talk was you're trying to think of design in a broader view, where you kind of like have, you're kind of going beyond human.
Yeah.
So where does like the accountability, because I don't think designers have like this institutionalized, common shared
Yeah.
oath that we take.
Yeah.
And I want to know your opinion on it, and also like, do you think it institutionalizes design, or do you think it also makes you more accountable as a designer?
Yeah, I mean,
Thank you.
but yeah, thank you for the question. And I think that, so you talk about with doctors, they take Hippocratic oath, and certain engineers have to be part of, they also have a kind of governing council. And the same is true of architects, that you could lose your license to be an architect. And for other forms of design, we don't have that. And I think that is one measure. It's really an applied ethics. And so how do you take an understanding of ethics and apply it, and you have a standard for what you always need to meet in order to meet those, to keep your license, so to speak. I think that's valuable, but I wonder to what degree it's adaptive or addresses the situation we're in, which I think is not just changing, but really of a scale and understanding that we've not experienced before. And I worry sometimes about applied ethics of this notion of standards. And I think that in a sense we could take a notion that ethics are performative. Ethics are situational. And I think that, so that's in part why I wanted to make that part of design. So that's why I wanted to focus on the notion that we bring politics and design. I understand what you're saying about design policy. I think it's good, but and I think if you think about like civic infrastructures and designing for better ways in which people can participate, in communities. But I sometimes wonder when we look at that as a design problem, and we don't necessarily see ourselves in that same citizenry, and we don't have the same political impacts, and we're designing for others in that sense. I worry a little bit. I'm not saying it's always the case. But I do think we do both. We do all. I think we do need to rethink the notion of the design problem and understand ultimately that design as a project or whatever you're designing is political. It requires negotiation, and we need to bring that in, and before especially we think we understand what it means to truly negotiate. So I just say those two things. I think I don't think it would hurt to have these kind of applied ethics, but I think that the question of standard is really a challenge because that changes, and we don't really know again. So we need to bring that ethics and make it performative. But we need to tune ourselves to that. We need to get sensibility around that. We need to have a vocabulary that is part of our practice of whatever it is that we're designing, or the different practices of designing. So I do think that I don't see that now. I don't see that understanding. I think until we get rid of the notions that design has these unintended consequences or externalities that we are not a part of, until we can work around that and not have those as escape hatches, then I think we'll be better off in the different ways we design. But I'm talking about one particular one. I'm talking about designing things, because I wanted to open up that there are other ways to design, of course.
Okay, cool. So I'll go here and then there. It's okay?
Thank you for the talk. I think the ideas are very important and necessary. And I have kind of two questions. The first one is, so with the example, I was thinking of the street light that's designed for people that are looking at cell phones. A bit of it kind of feels reactionary. So I'm thinking like, how does that, so because if we design for people with cell phones and then the technology then adapts and people are not gonna use cell phones anymore, then the next, is that kind of designing for the short term? Or do you see it in a different way?
Yeah, I see it in a different way. I mean, I think that in some sense, I think we could argue, so I think there's a common notion that we as designers need to have this foresight. We need to have an understanding of the future. And I think that gets us away from understanding the present. And so I guess I don't really see the notion between short-term and long-term responses, because I think if you think in ecological terms, it's always responsive. And so if there is an immediate thing, it can appear, but yes, it can also disappear. So we have the whole, in fact, I read about in the book, the whole traffic intersection can disappear. And in fact, in many cities, it has disappeared. You know, we're moving away from, I mean, the whole reason we have a traffic intersection is because of the main predator of traffic are people in cars. And it's trying to keep everybody else safe. And this can disappear as we shift. So there's nothing about being in a network or an assemblage that says you're always going to be here. And that's relates to a kind of relational thinking. So that kind of changes. But so I think in that sense, I wouldn't see it as reactionary. I think that is just the matters at hand that we have now. And that, you know, movement of people, or the movement of goods, or the movement of things is going to change and have its own, you know, trajectory or patterns. And then, yeah, the other point, which I just think that I don't think it's our job to predict the future as designers, because we always get it wrong, you know? And so, but we keep predicting the future. We keep designing something for the future, and then these things just end up, you know, I mean, you know, the most obvious end up in the landfill, but because it's not so much that it doesn't meet some purpose, but we create an imagined purpose. In some ways, as designers, the worst narrative for designers, and this is not true of everybody, but the worst narrative of designers is we've constructed a practice where we are always in a position where we can design. So we create a design problem, we situate that design problem so we can solve it. I mean, that's the whole point of a design problem. But we make it in such a way that we can solve it. We predict a future that we have control over because there's nothing to resist it in a sense. And of course, that's a caricature, but you know, I think we have to speculate. I think we have to critically imagine. But one of my favorite phrases is this idea of not speculative fiction, but speculative friction. That we speculate and imagine a way where we can kind of get some response. So, yeah, that's my answer to that
thank
question.
you. Yeah. My second question is, do you have any ideas about how to implement this kind of thinking and designing into larger industries, for say, who are more driven by deadlines and money costs, basically?
Yeah, and I addressed this kind of at the end of the book, is what am I asking of designers? And I think there's different contexts. So I addressed this whole thing about those who don't fully, like, I mean, ultimately, I argue that we need a new collective structure, so that may or may not include I know it will not include the industries as they are structured now. I mean, if we look at what's happening with many of the companies, not all, but certainly the ones, of the larger ones, which we know all the issues around the large tech companies. But I think that you can still put in that context, in that sort of practical, if you don't fully buy this, if you're in another nomadic practice, like you design products, I think there's an awareness of biographies that you can bring into your understanding of design. You can begin to understand about what is the end of this product that we're going to design. How are we going to design? I mean, there's some discussion around life cycle assessment, but I think it just becomes too complicated. In some sense, everybody understands the notion of biography. Then it's about, okay, I really have to understand all of the aspects of this, and I and my collective structure in my industry, we are responsible. So I think that is helpful. I think the idea that we have to pay attention to collective structures, which I think does happen, which I think is happening amongst you hear this thing now about activists within, you know, the software, the tech companies, and what they're doing is not this innovation, but they really are actively rethinking and pressuring those to rethink the structure of the organization. And I think that's also something that we can do. And I think it's just having an awareness of why we are doing it, and to what, you know, what's some vocabulary that could help guide us. So yeah, I do think that some of what I'm talking about is applicable, but ideally what I would like is someone to buy it completely, you know, in the commitment sense. And then I think particularly, I think that the focus is not on designers now, but people that are wanting to be designers now and can think what that structure is and what's the good in design, because I think that's one of the things we're really struggling with.
Thank you. So we have another question here.
So my question goes back to the example also on the street, the crossing. So in that sense, it's like you're designing sort of for a human behavior that is already there. So you're analyzing how this human is like doing the everyday action and then designing for it. But to which extent should we like design this way towards a behavior that is already there, or like designing to shape a behavior towards something different. So this discussion they had, like, should we be designing for people to be using cell phones still? Like, how can we like shape or shift in a way like this human behavior towards making it something different or better, as we think is better, because it's always relative? Or should we just like be adapting to what we see that is already there, because in some way change is already happening and you just need to follow it sometimes, but sometimes it's just better to like change and shift a bit the things.
Yeah, I think that, so a lot of this idea of, I mean, I don't know how you go about, you know, the practice of design, but for many, this idea of these choices that you just outlined are seen as individual choices of designers, aspirations of individual designers of how you implement. But this is my point about constituencies, that I think it's the kind of structures that engages in the politics of the very, what kind of world do we want to cohabit? So that's what I meant about a traffic intersection can disappear, because that's not the world we want to cohabit. We don't want a world in which we have cars, you know, obviously releasing carbon, but also just polluting and our city. We want a different city. We want to cohabit the world differently. The degree to which we want to cohabit the world with the kind of communication technologies is a whole other question. Right now, it's just seen within this notion of consumerism. And I think that you do have to revisit these questions. My point, you know, revisit the questions of, well, what is it that we want? How do we want to connect? And who? Because it shouldn't be universal. I mean, one of the problems we have now is we tend to think about these as universal questions, the universal answers, and then we go with that is scale. What's the big company that everybody in the world needs a mobile phone? Everybody in the world doesn't need a mobile phone. That's insanity. So I think that it returns to that. The point I was trying to make was not whether we should design for people with mobile phones. The point I was trying to make that there is this interconnectedness of this assemblage that takes on a trajectory of its own. Where I bring that home is a question for you about whether the traffic intersection is an anti-biography. Is this the world we want to cohabit? And how do we, and this is what I don't think we understand. So I don't think within design terms, we leave it to others to regulate. And we work within the regulations, you know, and I think that, so, I don't think it's the choice of individual designers. And I think that we also can't leave this as something for others to regulate the world we want. We don't do it alone as designers. That's a kind of arrogance that says we know a better way that people should communicate, right? We need to do this collectively, and then we also do this with others that do other activities, policy, you know, municipal governance, all of these others, urban planning, all of these other things need to work together. That's how I see it.
Okay, thank you. So I think that with this, we'll finish the round of questions. But I also want to ask you a question to the audience, which is like, yeah, I always do the same. So what are you taking from this presentation? So what do you take with you from what Ron said? So is there someone that wants to answer that? So I'm not asking to the quiz. I'm not at the quiz, but almost. Is there someone that wants to say, like, what first comes to your mind after seeing this presentation? What do you think you can take to your own design practice? Dun, dun. Yeah, sure.
For me, I think it's kind of refreshing to hear, because for so long, human-centered design was kind of in the highlight of design education, and also kind of the point of, I like the point of biography, thinking about the end, but also that we don't know everything, and there are so many different factors at play when we're designing. So in order to, like, not putting too much pressure on us to design the perfect thing and it'll execute a perfect way, just kind of accepting as designers that we're working with everything else, and also as humans. I think that was a great point.
Thank you. Is there anyone else that wants to say a few words about what he or she has learned? Okay. I'm not going to ask everybody. Don't worry. Don't get scared. So just one more.
Yeah. it's not exactly something I learned, but something came to my mind whilst you were presenting, and kind of like an alternative question to what you were saying. It's not putting like a human into the perspective of being the only one who designs something, but like non-humans designing things as well, designing with humans, but like flipping the perspective, and how could that be done, or if there are any points for collaboration from that side as well. Yeah, but just something to make me think about.
Yeah.
Cool. And do we have a final reflection to call it a day? Yes, no?
We get out of here if someone says yes.
Yeah, exactly. And I'm sorry for the people online that can't really interact with us. We can't really see what you are asking, but I will check later. So, well, if there's no more remarks or reflections, so I'll just use my last words to thank Ron again for this amazing presentation, and hope to see you soon again here at Elizaba, but also with the students of the master program and the rest of the people that come here in person or online. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
So I'll just ask the people from the